Welcome to our second lesson on terrestrial biomes. And while you guys enjoy this nice little comic right here, let's talk about what terrestrial means. Terrestrial means land. And if you speak Spanish, you've got a little advantage because you can think of tierra, which also means land. So these are land-based biomes. Let's talk about aspects or characteristics of them. So that way, we know what we're talking about before we talk about the particulars. So a biome is technically defined as a large terrestrial area that's characterized by similar climate, and this one is a big one, soil, plants, and animals. These tend to converge around lines of latitude, which I will show you guys on the next slide. And the organisms, or the plants and animals that live there, are almost entirely determined by the climate, because they have to be the types of organisms that are adapted to that climate and can survive in it. And a lot of times these are classified by their predominant vegetation type or predominant type of plant, such as forest, grassland, etc. So here we're looking at a map of the world, but we're specifically looking at a map of the climate. Pay attention to these lines on the side, which are 0 degrees, meaning the equator, 20 degrees south, 40 degrees south, 60 degrees south, 80 degrees south, and what they don't have labeled here is this is 90 degrees south, which is the pole. These are the lines of latitude. You know the most famous one as the equator, and they extend both north and south of the equator. So sometimes I'll talk about the latitude increasing, meaning we're moving towards the poles. Now what this map is important for is it shows you these general climate trends of various areas. So just so you don't have to read the tiny key and look at everything, this area tends to be more hot and wet. So it tends to have a tropical climate and more precipitation. These areas tend to be hot and dry. So they have either tropical or subtropical environment, but they get very little precipitation. Then closer to the poles from that, there tends to be a seasonal area, meaning that it has definite seasons, warm summers, cold winters. We live in a seasonal region, though we live kind of on the border of that hot and dry area. And then you have closest to the poles, the coldest regions, and they also tend to be very dry as well. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is how the different biomes tend to line up along with those climate patterns. It's not a perfect exact alignment, and we'll talk about why later when we talk about climate, but for the most part, where that hot, moist region was before, that's where you tend to find your tropical rainforest. Then in that hot, dry area, that's where you tend to find your deserts. Though there are a couple of exceptions to that. For example, here we see desert in the interior of the United States, the interior of the continent. We also see some deserts in the interior of Asia as well. So deserts are defined by the lack of precipitation. Then we have temperate grassland, temperate forest, taiga, and tundra. So notice we have these strips of biomes that occur as we move either farther north or farther south from the equator. You can also look at this relationship by looking at graphs like this. So here we see annual precipitation on the y-axis graphed versus annual average temperature on the x-axis. And note, areas that have low annual precipitation and low annual temperature, those are tundra. If you have a little more precipitation and a little higher temperature, that's going to be boreal forest, which is another name for taiga. If you have even more of an increase in temperature and precipitation, you go into temperate rainforest. The fact that it has such high precipitation means it's called a rainforest. And then when you get to the highest temperature and the highest precipitation, that gets you a tropical rainforest. Now, if you're still at a higher temperature in a tropical climate, but you get less precipitation, that becomes tropical seasonal forest and savanna. And then even drier than that would become a subtropical desert. That's like the Sahara Desert. And then your intermediate temperature and precipitation ranges would get you temperate seasonal forest. That's the kind of forest that, like, the leaves change color in the fall. think like New England. If you've ever seen Family Guy, the episode where they talk about the leafers who go to watch the leaves change colors. Then you get woodland and shrubland as the precipitation decreases, and then temperate grassland and/or cold desert. In general, as you go towards higher precipitation, you're more likely to have forest. As you decrease precipitation, you then move into grassland or shrubland, and then finally, the lowest precipitation will have desert. As far as temperature goes, the higher the temperature, the more towards tropical that you are. In the middle is kind of seasonal, and then you've got your coldest temperatures would be things like tundra and taiga. Now keep in mind that you can have another thing besides latitude influence your average temperature, and that's altitude. So if you look at, say, a mountain, you're going to find up here where it's going to have the coldest temperatures, probably something like a tundra ecosystem. Then below that, you might have something that's got an ecosystem very similar to taiga. Then below that, you might find like a seasonal forest. So as you go higher up the slope, temperatures decrease, and then you start moving towards these biomes that have the lower average temperatures. So now we're going to talk about the major terrestrial biomes. For each biome, what you're going to see is a map on this first slide that shows the approximate location of this biome on a world map. They tend to be similar world maps, though there were some a little different. So you can see that this biome, which is the taiga, is found primarily in the northern hemisphere, and it's going to be found mostly in like Alaska, Canada, and then in the northern parts of Europe and extending throughout a lot of Russia. So these are also called evergreen coniferous forest as well as boreal forest. If you've ever heard of the aurora borealis, that's where the boreal name comes from. Now, on each of these slides, you'll also see the major plant adaptations and animal adaptations, and I tried to group them for similar adaptations. For example, the taiga has mostly evergreen trees, usually coniferous ones, so cone-bearing trees, and the reason why is because they are better adapted to the conditions in the taiga, primarily being extreme temperatures of cold in the winter, as well as lower precipitation levels. So to help them survive these long cold winters, cone-bearing evergreen trees keep their needles year-round. That way they don't have to put in a lot of energy to regrow them when spring comes. Also, since they're always present, then as soon as light starts hitting that area more often, they can start photosynthesis immediately. They have needles for multiple reasons. They do not release a lot of water, so they help to retain moisture. They're covered in a waxy layer that also helps to prevent evaporation. They don't contain a lot of sap, so when it gets to freezing temperatures, there's not as much liquid to freeze and kind of rip apart the leaves. They can also, because of their color, since they're dark colored, they can absorb more sunlight, and also they contain some chemicals that are nasty tasting to repel animals to hopefully prevent the plant from getting eaten. You have some other adaptations as well. For example, the standard traditional Christmas tree shape where it's like a triangle. Those trees are shaped like that on purpose. They also have drooping branches, and the purpose of all of this is to shed snow, because if too much snow gathers on a tree, it'll break the branches. And then the ground freezes during winter months, so plants can't get water, which is another reason why they have to retain moisture. Animals, their adaptation, since they're mobile, they're able to migrate to warmer climates. So some organisms, some animals, will just live in the taiga or even the tundra in the summer, and then they'll move to warmer climates during the winter. They can also hibernate, meaning they will go into this kind of, it's almost like a long sleep, but it's actually physically different from that, where they're lowering their metabolism, they're not burning as much energy, and they usually eat to store up fat so that way they can survive their hibernation. Think bears. If they do stay in the region, they can do a couple of things to adapt to it, including having insulating feathers or fur to help protect them from the cold. And then also a lot of species that live in that area will have seasonal changes in their fur or feather color to help them camouflage. So they'll tend to turn their fur or feathers white in the winter to blend in with snow, and then brown during the summer to blend in with the trees when a lot of the snow is melted. Another thing you'll see for each of the biomes is what's called either a climatogram or a climatograph. I've heard it called both things. What this shows is it shows the average monthly precipitation per month over the course of a year, as well as the average monthly temperature. Keep in mind, this is a science class. Everything is going to be in metric. So the monthly precipitation is in millimeters, and the average temperature is going to be in degrees Celsius. Notice that there are two y-axes on this. This lets you show twice the data on the same graph. So when we look at the bars, the gray bars, that's showing us monthly precipitation, and we need to use the axis on the left. When we're looking at the average monthly temperature, that is the line graph, and that is going to be used with the axis on the right. So just keep that in mind. Then you'll also have just a short description of the climate. So the taiga tends to have long, dry, cold winters. Notice that when this is in Finland. That's important to keep in mind where this is, because some of these climatograms are for locations on the southern hemisphere, and we'll talk about why that's significant when we get to one. So in the winter time, notice that the precipitation levels are lower, so they're going to be drier winters. Also notice the temperature dips to below 0 degrees Celsius. So this is when it's freezing temperatures. And you're going to have less plant growth, a lot of animals migrating away. But the temperature does get warmer in the summer months. So in July, you'll have this mild summer where the temperature is reaching 20 degrees Celsius at the 20 degrees Celsius is kind of like the upper 60s in Fahrenheit. So these places will not reach they probably won't reach 70 degrees Fahrenheit in a normal summer. And like I said, most of the precipitation tends to come in the summer. Other than that, it's lower precipitation. You'll also want to pay attention to the axes on this, because some places might look like they have higher precipitation, but they don't reach to as high a number. So notice the maximum amount of precipitation we get in the taiga is about 80 millimeters, and this is per month. All right, moving on to the next biome, temperate rainforests. Note that a lot of these tend to be coastal, although there are, of course, some that are not coastal, like these guys here in the interior of China. Temperate rainforests are located at higher latitudes, so they're going to be closer to the poles, but they still get a lot of rain, and that has to do with a lot to do with their adaptations, especially of their plants. So the plants also tend to have cone-bearing evergreen trees. The reason why I said they're huge is because this is where the famous California redwoods are, and those trees are so massive, I think they've built like tunnels through some of them that cars can drive through. Since these trees are evergreens, they stay green year-round and keep their leaves, that means they can photosynthesize in the winter, so even when there's not a lot of sunlight, they can still take advantage of it. The evergreen trees, since they're constantly leafed, will always be forming a light blocking canopy, so any plants on the forest floor will have adaptations to try and get more light, such as higher concentrations of chlorophyll, which is the chemical or the pigment that they use for photosynthesis. Then there are some that will hang from branches of large trees to get more sunlight. We'll talk about these again when we talk about tropical rainforest, but they're called epiphytes. The tree bark is thicker. It helps to protect the inside of the tree from cold temperatures, so that the sap that's moving through the tree doesn't freeze and damage the tree. And it can also help protect the tree from parasitic fungi, which otherwise would grow. If you've ever been, like, say, outside when we're having a particularly rainy season, you'll probably see more mold growing. You might see some mushrooms pop up. Fungi thrive when it's moist. it's a rainforest, so it's going to be moist. And then you'll have things like there are these fallen logs, which act as nurse logs for seedlings, young trees, that can be used for nutrients, for moisture, and even for warmth when it's cold. The animal adaptations are going to be very similar to those in the taiga and tundra. They're going to be things like thicker coats, except not only to protect from low temperatures, but also just to protect from moisture. These animals also may migrate or hibernate during the winter to deal with a lack of food. Food resources will decrease when it's winter. And these guys will use either snags, which are dead trees, or nurse logs as nesting sites and even a food source. The climate, if you look at, notice that we go on the scale of precipitation all the way up to 180 millimeters per month. Remember that the highest monthly precipitation we saw in the taiga was about 80. So notice we're getting more precipitation. Also notice that, oh, my bad. That's about 140 is our maximum that we actually grab. No, wait, 160. My bad. Notice that the temperature does vary seasonally. There's definitely a winter and a summer. So the maximum temperature is going to be around, looks like around 27 degrees Celsius, which is closer to about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So it gets warmer than taiga. There are very cool areas in the winter. They're very moist. Notice they get a lot of rain, but the rain can be seasonal. So this is a climatogram for Oregon, which is a place in the United States where we have temperate rainforest. And then not only is there high annual rainfall, but there are also plenty of fog and clouds that can provide some additional moisture. And the temperatures tend to be mild year-round. Notice that they don't go below freezing, and they don't even tend to go on average below like 5 degrees Celsius. Moving to the next biome, here we have temperate seasonal forest, which is also called deciduous forest. These are the types of trees that lose their leaves in the winter, so they drop their leaves. This is, like I said, the eastern United States, also some of the eastern Texas. So if you've ever driven towards Louisiana, you start going into those very forested areas. That's our temperate seasonal forest. You see some on the coast of South America. Most of Europe used to be seasonal forest before it was settled, and you've got this large swath in China as well. Here you have these thin, broad leaves to capture lots of sunlight to make food in their warm weather, because they have definite seasons with a warm summer. However, when the weather gets cooler, those broad leaves would lose too much water. They would get weighed down by snow, so the tree drops them. That's what we mean by deciduous. That means basically that they drop their leaves, because we're going to see the term deciduous again. And then those leaves, when they fall, they start decaying somewhat, but they produce a really nutrient-rich soil. And then a lot of plants that live on, say, the forest floor will try and bloom and have a lot of growth in spring before the trees grow out their leaves, because that's the way they'll get light. Animals will do some similar things as they do in the other biomes we looked at. They might hibernate in the winter or migrate to other areas. They can also grow thicker fur, have like a winter coat, or they can grow layers of fat during the winter to keep them warm. And then they can also have those seasonal changes in fur or feather color. You know, white snow in the winter to blend in with the snow, brown in the summer to blend in with the trees. And some of them will store food for winter. So think of squirrels hiding acorns everywhere. This climatogram is for Knoxville, Tennessee. So if we look at the average monthly temperature, it goes up to around 25 degrees Celsius, and in the winter goes down not quite to freezing. Doesn't mean that it never freezes there, it's just the average monthly temperature isn't freezing. So this maximum temperature that they'll reach in the summer is around 75 or so. That's what 25 degrees Celsius is like. So they have warm summers, but they also get cold winters, and being a forest, they get lots of precipitation. Notice the scale here goes all the way up to 250, but our maximum amount of precipitation looks like it's around 125 millimeters. But also look at the fact that it's got fairly consistent precipitation throughout the whole year. The tropical rainforest, now we're getting into the warm areas, and here you notice from the southern part of Mexico all the way through South America down to the Amazon, as well as in the Caribbean. There's a large chunk of rainforest in West Africa, as well as some along the coast with Madagascar. There's some in India going through to Southeast Asia, as well as Indonesia, which has a lot of rainforest. The adaptations here are mostly to very, very high amounts of precipitation. And so they have, for example, drip tips, which are leaves that are very pointy, and that helps the water to drip off so it doesn't collect on the leaves and weigh them down. The soil is pretty nutrient poor. A lot of the nutrients just get kind of pounded out by the rain. So trees will have these very wide buttress roots that help spread out to kind of keep the trees from falling over, and will also help them get as much nutrient as possible. There are also plants that are called epiphytes. We talked about them before. Epi means on top of, phyte means plant. So it's a plant on top of a plant. These plants live on the branches of trees, and they live high up so they can get more light, but they're not parasites because they don't take anything from the trees or harm them in any way. These trees will tend to have thin bark that's not good at preserving moisture because they don't need to. It's a waste of their energy. And their bark tends to be smoother to prevent other plants from climbing on them. Because while epiphytes don't damage the trees that they grow on, there are other plants that can grow around other trees and then basically strangle them out. Animals have some different adaptations as well. Camouflage is a very big deal, sometimes mimicry, so they'll look like other species that, other species know to stay away from. They can be nocturnal versus being awake during the day. There's a lot of niche differentiation because there's a lot of competition. The tropical rainforest is full of resources for animals, but it's also full of other animals competing for those same resources. So there's a lot of resource or habitat partitioning, like this group of monkeys will eat from the tops of the trees. This group of birds will eat lower down in the trees. Some of them will be active during the day and eat from the trees. Others will be active during the night and eat. So that way there's less competition and everyone can survive. There's also something called aposematic coloring, which is when some animal has very bright, very vivid colors that warns predators, hey, I'm poisonous. So think of those very bright, poisonous dart frogs. The climate in a tropical rainforest is, of course, rainy. Notice the scale here for precipitation. In some months, the monthly precipitation on average is 300 millimeters, twice as much as the heaviest rainfall we've seen anywhere else. Then there can be a bit of a dry season, but the dry season won't last more than a couple of months. Other rainforest areas, this is in Brazil, but in other rainforests you might see that the precipitation is pretty much year-round very heavy. Also notice, since it's tropical, the average monthly temperature is pretty high. That's going to be probably close to 80s to 90s. And to be a tropical rainforest, it's basically an area that doesn't really freeze very much. Shrubland, this is kind of intermediate between forest and other area. This is a place where you don't have enough water to support trees, but you got a little more water than you need to support grass. So notice these areas are not, not in the rainforest, but they kind of bracket it. They're areas that get less moisture than a forest. Largest chunk of this is in Africa. There are also some similar biomes. Chaparral, for instance, is also sometimes called Mediterranean. That's because it's found around the Mediterranean Sea as well as in California. You can also have a biome called Woodland that's also kind of classified like this. So most of the adaptations are trying to conserve water. So the plants may have needle-like leaves, which helps reduce the amount of water that can exit. They'll be covered in wax to help keep them from losing water. They might have succulent leaves or stems. A succulent is like a cactus in that it stores water. So aloe vera, cacti, anything that's got like a large water storing part, that's a succulent. They might also have some other water storage organs. So some trees have like these large structures in their roots that are designed to store water. And then also they can have these very long roots to reach deep underground to reach groundwater sources, since there's not as much precipitation. It's also warmer in these regions, so the leaves are adapted to reflect sunlight. And then another big thing, there's a lot of wildfires in these areas, which also kind of explains why there's so many wildfires in California, though it's gotten worse. And you know, when lightning strikes, area catches fire, and it's a dry season, so there's not a lot of rain and moisture, and so plants are adapted to surviving through frequent fires. Or there are even some plants, their seeds don't germinate until after they've been through a fire. Also, they're trying to protect their resources from animals, so sometimes you'll have very thorny plants to kind of keep themselves safe. Animal adaptations are also very similar. They retain water wells, so they've got adaptations to keep themselves from losing as much water. Some of them will be nocturnal. Others burrow underground where it's a little cooler, and camouflage is just an animal adaptation everywhere. You also have some large grazers that will have very large bodies but eat mostly plants. Think elephants. Here is a climatogram for Johannesburg in South Africa. Now, I want to note, South Africa is down here. South Africa is in the southern hemisphere. And keep in mind, their summer is our winter, and their winter is our summer. So notice that the temperatures dip the most in June and July because that's during their winter. Also note the temperatures don't get too high. It is pretty far from the equator, but they also don't go that low in the winter. The precipitation, notice there's a very noticeable wet season in their summer from like October through March, and then from around April to September, which is their winter, there's a dry season. It can be cool and slightly moist in the winter, but it's going to be hot and dry in the summer. Temperate grasslands. Grasslands are generally regions that get kind of intermediate amounts of precipitation. Notice we got the large grassland in the center of North America. We've got some large ones in South America, a lot of the central part of Asia, and there's also some in Australia and some in Africa. So temperate grasslands tend to have deep, fertile soil, so plants grow very easily there. There are primarily grasses, and grasses have a lot of adaptations. So for example, in the winter time, when it's drier, they'll die back to the roots or down to the soil, and then that way the soil and the sod can protect them. So the roots live. The grasses above ground may look like they've died, but the roots live. That also allows the plants to endure fires, because there are some grassland fires too. Grasslands tend to not have a ton of hills. They don't have a ton of trees, so there's nothing to really bend to block the wind. So grass stems are very flexible, so that way when there's a strong wind blowing, they don't break. They've also adapted to be wind pollinated as well. There's a lot of wind there. Why not use it to pollinate the plants? Since they have lower precipitation, they tend to have narrow leaves to minimize their water loss. Also, if you think about cows roaming around or buffalo roaming around, they tend to eat grass, they tend to eat from the top. A lot of plants grow from the tip, and if you ate the tip of the branches, then they would die off, or they wouldn't be able to grow more. But grass grows from the base of the stem, so it doesn't matter if you eat off the top, they'll still be able to grow. Of course, this is also why you have to mow your lawn regularly. The leaves contain this hard chemical called silica. You've probably seen silica packets inside something. They'll say, don't eat desiccant or silica. It's really tough, and it's not pleasant to eat. And that's an adaptation for grass to try and prevent other things from eating it. They have an extra set of roots, more roots, that will help hold the soil in place, and that also reduces erosion, which is also why it's a big deal when you remove grass from an area that used to have grass. The dirt will usually blow away with the wind. Animal adaptations, a lot of them have to deal with trying to get that grass. So the animals that live there may have broad, flat-topped teeth to let them grind grass, and then they'll have digestive systems with specializations to let them feed on grass. For example, multiple stomachs. You may have heard about cows having multiple stomachs. Some of them that burrow will have short limbs and sharp claws or teeth so they can dig. Nocturnality is also an adaptation because there's not a lot of places to hide during the day. Camouflage in the grass. Small mammals also store food for the winter or for the dry season. And then some of them will live in herds to help protect themselves. Think giant herds of bison roaming the grasslands. So here we have a graph from Lesotho. Lesotho is right in here. It's a little country that's stuck inside South Africa. I call it the Cockerel Hill of countries, since Cockerel Hill is surrounded by Dallas. Notice it's in the southern hemisphere, so temperatures get lower in June and July because that's their winter. And their temperatures are going to be highest in January and December because that's their summer. So these places tend to have cold winters. Notice the significant dip. They're temperate, so they're seasonal. And then they tend to have hotter summers. Here we see we've got a definite dry season here. The precipitation is pretty low in the winter, and precipitation is pretty high in their summer. But notice that their precipitation on average for a month doesn't reach more than, looks like about 115 millimeters. So it's much drier than the areas we were looking at for forests. These tend to be located between temperate forests and deserts. So they're that kind of intermediate area. The savanna, if you want to think about this, notice a large chunk of it is in Africa. It's like subtropical grassland. You got some in Australia. You've got some in parts of South America as well. There's even a little bit of savanna down there in the Gulf Coast. So savanna is a type of grassland. So a lot of the adaptations that you have in a grassland will also be present in animals and plants in the savanna. So the plants there have long roots so that they can reach the water table. There's also frequent fires in the savanna, so that allows plants to survive fires. Another thing that can help plants survive fires is thick bark. During the dry season, notice that those plants become deciduous, meaning they drop their leaves, so that way they don't lose as much moisture through them. They might use their trunk to store water. Any grasses in the area turn brown or become dormant. And if you want to see dormant grass, like a month ago here in Dallas, unless you see people who water their lawns regularly, their grass was dormant and brown. The grasses can store moisture and nutrients in their roots to use during the dry season. They also are trying to protect themselves from grazers or animals that would eat them, so they might have a thick covering, spines, or even nasty tasting chemicals in the leaves. And then once there's the wet season, they grow really quickly because they're taking advantage of their resources. Animal adaptations during the dry season, they might migrate to a moister area, they might hibernate, or they might burrow to escape fires. Camouflage is important, and then also keep in mind there's not a ton of trees, not a lot of places to hide, so speed is an important adaptation for predators and their prey. Here we see the Serengeti, which is kind of the most stereotypical savanna. We've got a climatogram for that. And if we look, the axes are kind of switched, so temperature is on the left here. Notice that the temperature here is dipping in June or July, so this is going to be in the southern hemisphere because it looks like their winter is in June and July, and their summer looks like it's in December and January. So the rainfall, they definitely have a wet season and a dry season, so it looks like their wet season is their summer, going from November all the way through to maybe April or May, and April where they get most of their precipitation, but they've got this dry season in their winter. It's tropical or subtropical. It tends to be warm most of the year. Notice the temperature ranges between 20 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius. So that's probably between like 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe going up to 90 degrees. So it's going to be on the warmer side. The winters are mild but dry, and the summers are also kind of mild, though that looks like it's edging up and towards hotter area. You can also have thorn forests, which are kind of related to the savanna as well, found on the equatorial sides of hot deserts, basically closer to the equator, and they're a little drier. That's what aridity means. Arid means dry. And because they're a little drier, they don't have as many grasses. All right, let's talk desert. Deserts are actually not always hot. You can have a cold desert, but here we're focusing primarily on hot deserts. So through the American Southwest, a little chunk in Brazil, a little bit off the other coasts of South America. Of course, we have the Sahara in the Middle East. There's some in the center of Asia, center of Australia, and a little bit on the tip of Africa as well. Deserts are primarily characterized by a lack of precipitation. They don't get much rain, they don't get much water. So most of the adaptations are to try and make sure that you can retain enough water to stay alive. So for plants, they're succulents, meaning they store water. And which part of their body they store water in depends on the plant. Some of them stored in their roots, some like cacti stored in their stems, some stored in their leaves or even in their fruit. They will have either deep or widespread roots to reach either to reach groundwater, or widespread roots are often so that when they do get some precipitation, they can suck it all up quickly. They tend to have smaller leaves or spines to limit the surface area of their body that's exposed to the sun to help them absorb less heat. They have shiny, glossy leaves to reflect heat back. And then that not only reduces the temperature of the leaf, it also reduces the evaporation rate. They have a waxy covering on their leaves to help retain moisture. And leaves have these pores, these kind of openings on usually the underside that allow them to exchange gases, kind of like little leaf mouths. And in the desert, they only open those at night when it's cooler, so they lose less water. Animals, a lot of them are nocturnal, so they're awake and moving around during the cooler part of the day cycle, or they burrow underground where it's cooler. There are some animals that use their food as their primary or only source of water. Some of them have salt glands that let them release salt, which is a part of sweat. But instead of sweating, they release salt through salt glands so they don't lose water. Some of them don't have sweat glands. Some of them produce super concentrated urine. And then if you've ever wondered why camels have those fatty humps, those humps are not full of water, they're full of fat, but they're concentrated in the humps because instead of having it all around your body. Like if you have a little pudge on you, you'll feel it on your arms, you'll feel it on your fingers, on your legs, but camels hold most of their fat in one spot, so that way it's not helping the rest of their body retain heat. So it's an adaptation to let them lose heat. Deserts are defined as having less than 25 centimeters of precipitation per year. So notice this precipitation graph, the most that this area, which is Cairo in Egypt, gets in a month on average is 5 millimeters or less. And then there are these months where the average is 0. Notice that the average temperatures are pretty high. It never goes below 15 degrees Celsius, and it goes all the way up to 30 degrees Celsius, which is close to probably good 90-95. Deserts also have an evaporation rate greater than their precipitation rate. That means more water is going into the air than is coming out of it. And they might receive most of their rain in the summer, but this area here in Cairo, they're receiving most of theirs in the winter. Tundra, also known as polar grasslands. These are a grassland, though a lot of times they're just completely covered in snow. And notice they're at the extreme latitudes. So up here, there's also some tundra on the edges of Antarctica as well. Plant adaptations here are to low moisture because it doesn't receive a lot of precipitation, and to low temperatures. There's also something different about tundra. It's got a permanently frozen layer of ground called permafrost. And that permafrost is ice-filled, too frozen to be able to dig into, even for plant roots. So a lot of the plants there will have shallow roots. Because of this permafrost layer and also because of the low precipitation, you're not really going to have trees growing here. Notice it's north of the taiga. Plants may grow close together and low to the ground. They're actually huddling together to basically preserve warmth. Some can grow under a layer of snow. Others have adaptations to perform photosynthesis even when it's extremely cold, where most other plants would just break down and not be able to. Once summer starts and they start to get sunlight, plants flower really quickly to take advantage of it, and they're also minimizing water loss with their adaptations of their leaves. Honestly, not a lot of animals stay in the tundra during the winter. It's very cold. There's not a lot of food. Some of your food is covered under snow, so it's just not very feasible. So they'll migrate. Others may hibernate. Some of them, to preserve their warmth, will have double layers of fur, or they'll have body modifications. So their bodies are big with short arms, legs, and tails, which helps them retain heat. The climate. So let's look at Canada. Here, notice that the maximum temperature in the height of summer is 15 degrees Celsius. 15 degrees Celsius is like 58 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the warmest they get. Notice it gets all the way down to negative 25 degrees Celsius. That is well below, that's like below 0 in Fahrenheit. It gets very cold there. So most of the year is bitterly cold. There's ice and snow. It's not a ton of precipitation. So notice that the maximum precipitation they'll get in a month is 40 millimeters. That's not very much. And so it's drier there. What precipitation they get may be in the form of ice and snow, which makes it harder for organisms to get access to it. Their summer is short, 6 to 8 weeks, but for the like peak of summer, they'll have sunlight for like 24 hours a day. But in the peak of winter, they'll have darkness for 24 hours a day as you get closer to the poles. So since permafrost only melts on the surface in the summer, water that falls can't get through the ice, and the water from melting can't get through the ice, so it just collects on the surface, and the tundra actually becomes a marsh or a swamp in the summer, and it's pretty rich in resources, so a lot of animals migrate there for the summer to, get their buffet on. All right, so now we're going to look at how some of these aspects that cause, different biomes affect the availability of some non-mineral resources. So here, let's look at lumber and logging. I think it should be pretty obvious that, you're not going to be able to get lumber or get wood in areas that aren't forested. So here, the green areas on this map are showing areas where forestry is common, where they'll basically be cutting down trees for lumber. Mostly a lot of it's in temperate seasonal forest. Commodity-driven deforestation, like you see here, is they're trying to cut down the trees to get something. A lot of times it's to clear land for agriculture, and that's actually what's happening a lot in tropical rainforests. Agriculture tends to be most common either on grasslands or in areas with cleared forests. So this graph is showing you where you have cropland. Rain-fed cropland is the yellow areas, so notice a lot of that is Europe, and a lot of that is like the Canada-US border. Then there's plenty of irrigated cropland, so people can grow crops there, but they have to add extra water because without enough precipitation, you can't really grow crops very easily. Then you've got the areas where you don't grow crops as much, so notice that's going to be desert. Desert, you don't grow very many crops. And then also in areas where there's a lot of forest, you won't grow crops. In the boreal forest, it's too cold up there to really grow plants, and it's, when it's winter, it's very frozen, so it's not worth it. There's also less agriculture in the Amazon rainforest, but like I said, it's being cleared at times in order to provide agricultural cropland. Fresh water obviously is going to be more available where there's more precipitation. Where it's drier, there's going to be very little water available. So Here on this graph, we're seeing water scarcity. So where it's blue, water scarcity is not a problem. So here in the Amazon rainforest, they don't have to worry about whether they have enough water. Same here in this part of Eurasia, this part of Europe, this part of China, and a lot of North America. However, there are areas where water is scarce, and those tend to be more in desert areas. Notice that this is the desert in the Midwestern United States, as well as the northern part of Mexico. This is the Middle East, which has, desert-like conditions. Parts of Australia don't have very much water. And then economic water scarcity that's more difficulty getting water to people who need it, not necessarily caused by the fact that there's not water there. All right, what I mean by worldwide distribution of biomes being dynamic, dynamic means it can change. So biomes can change over time. Keep in mind that biomes are determined by climate. The climate of an area is what's going to determine what plants and animals live there and the biome. So climate can change over time. Climate has changed over time. So what you see on this graph right here is the current distribution of biomes. It should look familiar. We've been looking at something similar to this. Now what I'm going to show you is the kind of reconstructed climate of around 21,000 years ago. So scientists can recover data that lets them see, hey, what was the climate like before? Now, 21,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum, meaning the largest spread of the glaciers most recently. So notice there's a large chunk that's called glaciers. There was an expansion of the tundra. There wasn't that much taiga, but what was there was actually like in our area. Notice that things got drier, so deserts expanded, and biomes that require a lot of moisture, like tropical rainforests, decreased dramatically. When it gets colder, when temperature's colder, usually a lot of water in the planet is locked up in glaciers and frozen, and precipitation tends to decrease because cold air holds less moisture. When you have what are sometimes called thermal maximums, where temperatures are higher, then you're going to see that global temperatures rise and precipitation increases, but not around the world. So with climate change happening, there are predictions on how the distribution of biomes will change in the future because of climate change. So on the top graph, you see what the modern distribution is. On the bottom, you see a predicted distribution. Now, you don't necessarily see a huge spread in deserts, but notice that the extreme latitudes are what are mostly affected. Tundra pretty much disappears. Boreal forest shifts northward and decreases in size dramatically. And so you have a spread of temperate forest and grassland. A lot of Siberia and Russia, which is known stereotypically to be very cold, is going to become dry grassland or shrubland. And while you may think, oh, more precipitation because it's warmer, that's a good thing. It's also the precipitation patterns will change. So some areas that are used to getting lots of precipitation will get less. Other areas that are not used to getting much precipitation will get more. And we'll talk a lot more detail about that when we talk about climate change in Unit 9. For now, this is it. Have a great day.